When Sean rang me, it kind of triggered some thoughts I'd had about a drawing that I'd looked at quite closely about 8 years ago now. And while I was writing about this particular drawing, there were other things that were occurring to me about the drawing, which there wasn't the space and it wasn't the right place to actually write about in that particular paper. So Sean's phone call kind of gave me the opportunity to kind of rejig that paper that I presented around that drawing, and to kind of try and tease out these other ideas I was having about the drawing. And you might think, well, what's this got to do with paper? But you'll see what it's got to do with paper as we go along. So you may well know this drawing. It's a drawing that, well, the attribution is kind of disputed, the date is disputed, but it's often attributed to Paolo Uccello, and it's thought to have been maybe 1450, 1460, that kind of time. It's a curious drawing, and it's often reproduced in lots of art history books, and it's often held up as this kind of iconic Renaissance drawing. Iconic in the sense that it's this kind of, the triumph of the rational, this kind of using geometry and perspective to create this kind of pure form, and such a kind of a huge shift away from the kind of medieval and away from the religious and into something completely pure. But of course it is a chalice, so there's still that religious element to it. So in terms of what the drawing is, it's a completely fabricated drawing. It's completely, as it were, made up. The person hasn't sat in front of a chalice and tried to draw it. I suppose one of the reasons I became interested in this drawing was because I had a very strong inkling of how it had been made, but quite a lot of things I was reading about it were quite wide of the mark. There were quite kind of wrong interpretations of how it had been made. There's often references to grids and things like this in its making, and it's not quite like that at all. The drawing is actually 34 centimetres high, so it's quite a small drawing, but probably for that date, actually a standard size kind of drawing for the sizes, for the sheets of the paper. And in fact, this little bit here is actually glued on. That's an added on bit of paper. They'd obviously started the drawing and realised that actually they needed extra space and extended the paper down to fit that extra bit of drawing on. And you can tell that by the lines on the way the lines kind of interrupt the way it's being glued and so on. So in terms of the chalice, what you've got is almost like what we would now call a wireframe drawing, and it's built up out of these geometric shapes. Well, you see this kind of ring here, and there's another ring at the top, and they're usually referred to as mazzocchi, and they were the kind of framework within that were used inside Renaissance hats. But they really also just a very nice thing to draw when you're drawing things using perspective. That they're a kind of a bit of a challenge, and they were often drawn almost like an exercise. And when you see people doing perspective now, it's often that kind of shape you would do as a, maybe sort of intermediate stage in your proficiency in drawing perspective. So, in terms of drawing, it's quite unusual also that it's drawn as if you can see through it. Yes, you've got this kind of transparency, so you can see through this structure. And then some of it's drawn as being solid, and then some of it's transparent. So when you look at, that's just a detail of it, when you look at chalices from around that time, I mean, given that we actually don't know what the real date of the drawing is, you can see that it is picking up quite a few of the kind of forms and the ideas that you get in a real chalice. So quite a few of these objects, they're made up of sometimes octagons and hexagons, so quite a mixture of different kinds of geometry in the same way as the drawing was. You know, some of those matsuki are sort of hexagonal in kind of format, and then some are octagonal. So you get the same kinds of shapes and so on cropping up in these. The other thing, obviously, you can see you get precious stones embedded into these objects. And of course those precious stones are often cut, so you get the same kind of pointy shapes, you know, almost as if they were kind of cut bits of stones on. So there's a direct link between the drawing and the kinds of objects. And of course these things were made out of metal, you know, kind of polished metal, so there's a very strong connection there, I think, with light and the kind of, you know, reflection and kind of that sense of weightlessness that you get from things which are polished. So you see these are quite extravagant things. And even when, you know, it's not a chalice, you know, if it's a plate, they'll still have these precious stones embedded in different colours. And you know, with completely flat objects as well, you'd also get these precious stones embedded. So there's, I suppose, with these precious stones, one of the things you need to remember is that, I mean, it's the kind of thing we take for granted now, but they would have been seen as quite unusual things, this kind of pure thing that colours light. So there'd be a connection there between, you know, ideas of the heavens and God and knowing and light, and that all those kind of mix of quite interesting ideas that we probably now find quite hard to grasp completely. So this is quite an interesting one with this used stone, quite elaborate patterned stone as the main part, and then the metalwork's being worked around it. But again, you know, lots of quite complex patterns and bits of geometry. So, in terms of drawing that chalice, it would have been set out something like this. So what you're having to do is set out, well, basically you're drawing it layer by layer. So each of those, as it were, circles that are drawn, you're creating a plan of it, and then you're projecting it up into different layers. So the whole thing is built up in horizontal layers. If that makes sense. You kind of, in a sense, building a block, almost like a block of space, which you're then putting in horizontal layers and then drawing an ellipse in each of those layers, a 32-sided ellipse, and then you're joining all the sections up, and that creates the form. Does that kind of make sense? So whatever profile, I'll keep on pointing on here, should we point on that? So you work out your profile that you want to produce, and then that profile then gives you the different circles, as it were, in plan. Yeah, in the same way as an architect would set up, you know, using plans and elevations, you know, this would be set up the same way. So you'd start off with your kind of profile, then work out what that is in plan, the different size circles, and then you'd project each of those and then build it up. So it's very much a built drawing. You know, he hasn't just stood in front of a chalice and drawn it from observation. It's very, very much constructed. So that's what you then work towards. So it ends up being quite a complex construction, you know, almost with a sort of scaffolding that's kind of surrounding this object, and the thing is kind of held within this scaffolding. So what you're ending up with is a lot of construction work, as well as the final the final drawing. So, you might think, looking at this drawing, it's actually ink on paper. You think, okay, he's done all this construction work and then he's rubbed it all out. But it's not quite like that at all. Because that drawing is the same as that drawing. That is just a different photograph of the same drawing. So that's it photographed, so straight on with the light, straight onto it. This photograph has been taken with a raking light, so the light going across the drawing. I don't know if you can see it, but all of what looks like the kind of, that kind of pattern you get in paper, this is all construction work. I don't know how clearly you can see that. I've got some close-ups of all the bits. So all of these lines that you're seeing here, these are all the construction lines, but they're just inscribed into the paper. They're not, they haven't been drawn into with graphite or silver point or whatever. They've been just lightly scratched into the paper. And these kind of dots that you see here going up, dots all over the place, in fact, are pinpricks on the paper. And it's quite interesting because lots of art historians say, oh yes, it's got pinpricks all over it because it was then used to copy. Is it Spolvero? So when it's dusted, and so you could then reproduce it. But I think that's wrong, really. I think they're there as kind of just precise points. You would have been making this with sharp, very sharp instruments. A compass, almost like a pair of dividers rather than a compass. So he's using the point of the compass to be really precise about where it goes. So if you think about it, the way he would have drawn this, because he couldn't just draw it on the tabletop like this with general light, he would have had to have drawn it with a raking light in order to see the construction. And this is where, when I was writing this paper, this is where I started becoming quite interested in this idea that in order to have drawn this drawing, that in some ways is about light, he was actually having to use light itself to actually help him do the drawing, this kind of raking light. So what I was saying before about this kind of scaffolding, it's almost as if you're creating this scaffolding of light out of which this object then kind of emerges. So it was just, I started thinking about that just as this quite kind of poetic, quite an interesting idea that the two things were kind of parallel to each other. This, the process that he was using as well as the object that he was ending up with. Yeah, so I don't know if you can see that more clearly, these kind of dots going up. And again, this bit of paper on here that's just actually being glued on this bottom. So if you think back to those first diagrams I was showing about how the perspective construction works, what you end up with is a lot of radiating lines. So I hope you can kind of see these lines, these sets of lines, these sets of parallel, well, no, they're not parallel, the sets of lines here, which are kind of these radiating points, radiating from central points. I might need to go back and show you that. Yeah, so all those radiating lines, they're all completely visible on the paper. You can probably see them. I don't know if you can see them on there. It's kind of from each of these central points, there's sets of radiating lines. So that's what is there on the paper. This is me drawing it out, what's there. So every point, all of these marks that I've made in the process, all of those marks are visible on the paper. So in a sense you can check exactly how it's been done. Because when you set out to do it, you end up making all those the same marks, basically. But the other important thing about the drawing is that what we're seeing, you're obviously seeing that final drawing, but there must have been these other parts of the drawing which have been cut off. Either cut off or were done as a separate drawing, which were then, so those kind of measurements that you would take from the plan and from the elevation, those bits of information have now been lost, or we assume they're lost, they're not lying unrecognised in the Uffizi collection somewhere. So what we're seeing is just that, as it were, the final rectangular block of space with these other sections actually sliced off. Yeah, so all those marks on the surface are all the same marks that you see here, these radiating lines and so on. So you can see that it's an incredibly, just in order to produce that octagonal shape, the amount of marks, the amount of information you're having to get onto the paper. So in some ways just that technical feat of doing that drawing is quite something. Of that complexity of, all those layers so close together and being able to keep track of it all is quite something. That's one of the reasons I don't think it's a drawing by Uccello, because it is so precise and careful, and Uccello's never struck me as being that kind of artist. I'd be tempted to say that it was more likely to be somebody like Piero del Francesco, where that, it's quite clear he has that level of skill and precision. So again, what's interesting about this photograph is these photographs were done in about 1910. When you see the drawing now, it looks completely flat, as if somebody has almost ironed it. That's the kind of sense that you get from it. You don't get the sense there's any surface kind of disruption at all. But when you see it from the 1910 state, you're not sure, well, is it as rough as this? Is it completely creased down the edge? I have been to Florence to see it, and it was also shown in the British Museum a couple of years ago. There was a show of Renaissance drawings, and it does look completely flat. Absolutely flat. But as I say, in this, when you see it here, you really see how kind of.
But you can see the pinpricks and things.
I think not really. Actually, you can if you know to look for them, but I think you wouldn't notice them unless you were told they're there. Yeah. When I went to see it in Florence and got permission to go and get it out of the cabinets and look at it, it's amazing how little you can see. You can, but you really have to have seen this first to then know what to look for on the paper. And of course, when you then go away and start thinking about it, you think, oh right, I didn't look at that bit. So when I was putting this paper together, what I managed to get hold of was a very good scan of those original photographs, these original photographs, and then to blow them up onto a really big scale, so I could up to, it was kind of A1 size, so you could really see the detail and exactly what had gone on the paper.
So just Who took those photos then? Do you know?
There was a paper done in about 1910 about these drawings. It's one of the German journals, the Prussian art history journals. Yeah, but and what's said in those articles is actually very interesting and quite a good understanding of how the things have been made. But it's very much saying these are Uchara drawings, whereas now I think the general thinking is that they're not Uchara. And there's some recent articles have actually dated them much later, that they're kind of 18th century drawings. Which is where it becomes interesting looking at the paper, because nobody seems to have looked at the paper as a way of dating it. It's usually about this whole hang up about his Matsoki and Ucharo and so on. That seems to drive the kind of dating rather than looking at anything else about the drawings. I mean, one of the more recent papers was looking at some of these shapes and saying that they're particular mathematical forms which were only, it was only in the 18th century people started becoming interested in those kinds of forms and so on. So that's why those later dates have come out. So, thinking about the kind of geometry within the drawing, there's octagons and hexagons. So, I'm sure most of you know how to draw an octagon. But if you draw an octagon, you can then draw smaller octagons and then smaller octagons inside. And the reason I'm pointing that out is when you take the drawing and, as it were, because of the way it's being drawn, the profile of it is actually the true profile. Because in effect it's like taking a vertical slice of it. So if you can work out if you take the true profile, you can then think, okay, what connections there are between the design of it and the forms within it. So one thing that became really quickly apparent is that that Matsukyo, that octagonal Matsukyo at the top, the kind of the size of the octagons is the size that you would get if you drew that out as a square, and you had that smaller octagon there. When you draw an octagon, you try and draw a smaller octagon inside and then a smaller octagon inside. So the proportions of it have obviously been that they're a result of the process of drawing the Matsukyo, if you see what I mean. Because this, in effect, is the plan. The plan and the elevation become one and the same thing. Does that make sense? If you were going to draw that Matsukyo, you would have to have this as a plan, the kind of circles in plan. But that then is also the same as the elevation of the whole chalice. So there's this kind of quite clever play between using kind of information that you need to draw that Matsukyo, and then that also becomes the basis of the design of the whole thing. So it's quite a subtle use of rather than drawing out a separate drawing which has got no connection to any of the geometry you're actually using the geometry to actually create the design. The process becomes part of the design process. The process of drawing becomes part of the design process. I'm trying to find the best way of describing it. The process of drawing it in perspective, the geometry that's connected to that, then becomes the basis of the design of the object. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. So there is a precedent for that, because one of the other drawings in the Uffizi that's kind of associated with that is this drawing. And again, if you then measure the size of that, the octagons at the end, and compare it to the diameter, you do get the same relationship of an octagon within an octagon within an octagon. So there's obviously a connection between those two things. And again, there's a precedent for that as well, which is where if you're drawing a sphere, where the plan and the elevation become one and the same thing as well. And again, this is another drawing that's occasionally attributed to Uccello, where he's obviously done that, where the plan and the elevation become part of the design. The design comes out of the drawing process. And again, with these things where the plan and the elevation become the same. And an even more interesting kind of connection is that Leonardo's drawings of centralised churches actually used the same process. So again, what you've got is an octagonal setup, and then he's drawn a small octagon inside and then a smaller octagon inside that. So that smaller octagonal pattern in there bears the same relationship as the octagons in the Mazzocchi. So it's quite interesting that you can take this drawing of a chalice and look at the kind of geometry that's used in that, but then it's the same geometry then crops up in these Leonardo da Vinci drawings. That's just a kind of a close-up of that, kind of demonstrating how it works. And again, it crops up even later in the kind of 1700s, or 1600s. Where again, the plan that's drawn out in here also becomes the same as the elevation. So it's a very, kind of, in a sense, a very efficient way of drawing these objects. That they're using two bits of the same bit of information twice, using it as the plan and also as the elevation. So on the face of it, this drawing might look very different to that, but in effect, it's a very similar process that's gone on. I think I'll leave it there. So, if you want to, I've probably kind of rushed through that quite quickly, but I was aware that some of the kind of detail of the geometry might be, it's one of those things you need to sit down and work out on a piece of paper and actually test it out, which I'm quite happy to do. But yeah, if you've got any questions or comments or thoughts about what I'm suggesting about this kind of connection between the light, this kind of raking light, and that kind of process of using the light to help you actually draw something that's connected to light. It'd be quite interesting to hear if you've got any thoughts on that, or whether you think I'm completely barking up the wrong tree, or whether it's, of course, it's just a purely technical thing. There's no connection between the two things. But for me, as somebody who makes drawings, I think there's a very strong connection, and that kind of relationship between, the processes that you use and the ideas as they develop, those things become very intertwined. I don't see the kind of process and what you draw as being, they are connected, but for me personally, they become completely enmeshed with each other. And point where, but I won't show you them, but there are drawings I've done where I've found myself doing the same thing that's gone on in some of these drawings.
So Richard, would the paper be thick enough for, are they scored lines and actually drawn lines, all those radiant lines?
They're scored, yeah. But when you see it, it looks like incredibly fine paper. I couldn't. I think when I went to see it in New Fitzy, it was still in its mount, so I couldn't, as it were, turn it. I mean, you can turn it over, but I couldn't see what the back was like, so I couldn't get a sense of how thick the paper was. But it does look like very fine paper.
One thing I wasn't sure of when you showed the photographs, Richard, are you suggesting that since those earlier photographs that the drawings actually been flattened?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. You know, when I've seen it, as it were, in the flesh, you're not aware of so much kind of waviness and wrinkling on the surface at all.
And have there been different kind of, because I know, having worked in connection with different paper conservation studios, that they, when they conserve any kind of drawings at the British Museum or the V&A, that they do these different condition reports, and if it goes, if it travels, is there any kind of history since that point?
I suppose I've never looked into that side of it at all. But there must be, I'm sure. It is one of the Uffizi's very precious drawings, but they obviously do lend it out, and they're perfectly happy for me to sit with it and look at it.
Because it seems in a way like that would be a really interesting thing to try to understand, because if you're proposing that the way that it was drawn was a large part of that was where it was placed in relation to light, and that it could only evolve through that kind of interaction with light. And then what you're talking about is early 1900s.
It's about 1910, I think these photographs were taken.
It could, I mean, again, I'm thinking that a lot of procedures with conservation, as many of us know, have changed radically since that time, and certain things that were done to works of art now people are really regretting. And it would be interesting to, I suppose, as a further line of research to know, because that would, in some ways, would seem to prove or not prove your point to a certain extent.
Yeah, because I know when I saw it, I was amazed how sharp. I mean, it looks as if somebody's cut the edges with a scalpel. I mean, they really are absolutely, it's that kind of cut, like a thresh cut. Yeah. Somebody's trimmed it recently. That's what it feels like when you see it. But yes, it'd be interesting to follow it up. I just haven't had the time to do that yet. But it is odd how those two photographs, they're so different. And as I say, when you see it in the flesh, you wouldn't get any sense there was any kind of surface to it at all.
Richard, I'm interested in your relationship with this piece of work, because it's obviously a very long-standing, intimate one, and your relationship as a practitioner who's been thinking about this through actually making drawings yourself, and just thinking about the era, regardless of who it was done by, I guess, which whatever, that kind of way of looking at the world. Thinking about ideas of geometry, it wasn't just to do with drawing, but as you're showing, kind of architecture, anatomy, the heavens, the way that the world kind of revolves, literally. And I'm just wondering, you having this kind of intimate relationship with reenacting this drawing in some ways, I wonder how that expansion of the idea of geometry now works for you in your contemporary sense.
having looked at this drawing quite closely and thought about how it's been made, has made me feel a lot more relaxed about geometry and playing with it and what I do actually do on the paper. I mean, I think that's partly because there's a story, a sort of fairly standard story about perspective and geometry and the Renaissance and so on. And the more I've looked at these various drawings and different paintings and how they've been constructed, the less I'm convinced by lots of that story. And that in itself has given me more freedom in my own practice, because I think I suspect a lot of the things which are said about perspective and rationality and so on are actually slightly wide of the mark, which then makes it easier for me to be quite irrational in my own use of geometry and what I do on the paper. It's an odd sense of liberation that you can actually kind of disregard a lot of what's said about a particular thing within history. That you think actually, I'm not sure that way of thinking about it, that way of describing it is actually correct. I think things have been slightly skewed because of this notion of perspective and rationality and geometry and so on. And it's often put as part of this story of ever-increasing kind of accuracy or reality, realism or naturalism or whatever. And again, as an artist, it isn't like that at all. I'm not sure if that answers it.
It's sort of made me think about kind of other questions about, just trying to think about the contemporary, and I suppose the most obvious thing, and maybe it's a huge cliche, but to think about technology, we perceive so much of the world through computer-generated design, which gives us these lines and vectors and kind of spins them through space, and I don't know.
Yes.
Something that allows you to think of, or maybe kind of debunk or throw out in a similar way.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, kind of cliches about the Renaissance.
Yeah. I mean, I know I'm old enough to be aware when artists first started playing with computers and the whole thing of taking a profile and spinning it. This was the drawing that was done repeatedly. And I used to see those and I thought, well, it's that, okay, you end up with something that ends up looking like the drawing, but it's got nothing to do with how it was made in the first place. So, yeah, I mean, that question of technology and so on is really interesting. I'm sure every artist kind of understands that, the tools and so on do end up being a really important part of the whole process of making, whether you realise it at the time or not. I mean, in my own practice, all I'm using is paper, a straight edge, pair of compasses. That's all I use, and a pencil. And I suspect this has been constructed exactly the same way. There's no difference in terms of the tools that I have. It's exactly the same tools.
It's not exactly an irrational drawing, though, is it?
No, not at all. Except, I suppose it's not irrational. No, but the design has come through the drawing. So it's not.
Rather than being preconceived.
Rather than being
theoretical
preconceived, I think that's what I'm trying to get. That's what I'm trying to get at. That the process has then been part of the design. That the kind of drawing, the mechanism behind that is then being used as the design process.
Just propose that. I mean, you were suggesting that there maybe there were other drawings that were made in connection with it, or even attached to it, and then disappeared. But also, what about the strip at the bottom? What is your explanation of that?
Well, well, you can see. I mean, it is quite an interesting point, actually. I think.
It is a separate new bit of
It
paper.
is, yeah, it is, yeah. And it's been done, I suspect it's been done to make, because this bottom bit here, this bit here, which makes it then feel solid, is added on that square bit. That has been added on. That bit of drawing there isn't constructed. Has been drawn, as it were, freehand. That last little bit. So in order to get this bit, that bit of thickness added in, he needed to add on that bit of paper. If that makes sense. And you can see that from the construction marks. So that very last bit has been drawn by hand. It hasn't been constructed. So I suspect he got to the bottom and it felt wrong that those planes just, as it were, petered out onto the paper. And then, in a sense, to make it feel like an object again, he had to add on that extra little bit of those little vertical bits. That's my reading of it. And you can, because that line there, that construction line, is it is giving you that point. You know, so this little bit here is kind of added on by eye, so to speak.
But then the other ones that are in the same plane as that on the tier kind of two above, are they the same, or are they from some construction lines? The vertical lines on the row nearest the top. You see what I mean? There's an obvious.
That line there is referring to that one.
Yes, I see that.
And that one's referring to.
Yes, but if you go up to the row that seems to have a row of completely vertical lines.
Oh yeah, there.
The row above that one.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Then are they not relating to the geometry? Are they perpendicular lines?
Yeah.
Are they freehand or are they relating to the geometry as well?
They are drawn. I mean,
Yes.
he's plotted. I can't reach. He has plotted the point above and the point below, so he's drawn it down. But here, he hasn't constructed that point there.
No.
That has been drawn down. So I think he has got down to a certain point and then felt that it didn't feel, as it were, finished in the bottom. But yeah, I mean, it is speculation. You're trying to use your own experience to try and think of a scenario that might fit. And then, so I could be mistaken.
Did you think, sorry, that there were bits you think that have been removed where the construction's been necessary to one side?
Well, in order to do that, you need to have drawn out the plan of it, so to speak. So you either have this bit of paper attached to it, in which case it could be that he actually started off with two bits of paper which were attached and then it's been sliced. So you either have it physically attached or you have it as a separate bit of paper, which you then use dividers to take measurements. I mean, these are the measurements we've taken, each of these from that centre, and then you'd be transferring those measurements onto the drawing.
So it was interesting that those pieces were essential but missing or not included, but then there was this piece that was not constructed in the same way, that almost made the object or put it in a kind of space that was added after this other process had gone on.
Yeah.
It's almost like another person made that decision, or it become an object in the course of its process, and that, you know, that made it have to sit in space in some sort of way. There was, I don't know,
Yeah.
it's just my
Yeah. I mean, it could well be,
my occurrence.
yeah, that his original intention wasn't to set out, wasn't drawing this elaborate shape. He was just drawing that first Matsukia, that first big octagonal thing. And that's what I'd be tempted to say, that was actually the first bit that was drawn. Because you can tell when you look at the drawing, that lots of the, you know, the circles that he's used for that Matsukia then crop up, you know, they're the same circles lower down. So he's used the same information to then draw other bits of the drawing. And the same with some of the other shapes, you know, it's the same circle that then crops up lower down in the drawing. So you can almost track, you know, which bit he did first, which bit he did next, and so on. I mean, again, you can't be 100% sure, but it may be just sheer coincidence you end up with circles the same size. But you know, if you were drawing something that kind of scale, that kind of complexity, you would try and utilise bits of information twice.
Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't want to keep on, as it were, reinventing or redrawing the same thing over and over again.
Richard, can you estimate how long it would have taken to make the work? You know, given that obviously that you know you've drawn with the same technique.
Couple of weeks. I mean, the really impressive bit is that he's inked it in without screwing it up. I think that's the really impressive bit.
Does that mean that you also need an eraser?
You did mention Pierre and Francesca, so maybe
But he's
don't
actually
need to be
managed.
expected.
But he's actually managed to see clearly the things he's drawn and the shapes he's drawn, because you can imagine how, yeah, particularly, I mean, it's probably quite easy in some bits you can see the shapes quite clearly, but when they start going, as it were, going down the corner and they start overlapping, to keep track of which bit's attached bit to which, and to ink it in without inking in the wrong bit, I think is an incredibly impressive thing.
So these actually work in drawings to be manufactured then, actually?
No, I mean, I don't think there's any hint that this was, you know, to be made.
Right.
You know. Yeah, I don't think there's any kind of hint of that. Well, not that I can see anyway.
What I find quite interesting is that rather than to actually draw in guides with the set to be erased, if you were going to sort of leave the actual construction form itself, so all these marks have been scored into the paper to sort of render them invisible to a degree. It's sort of interesting that there's that many marks that you sort of perhaps hide each other just through the density
Yeah.
in there. But it's also interesting that just obliteration of the surface
Yeah.
in constructing it. And I sort of wondered if this is sort of particularly for the time in which it may be made sort of particularly high quality paper, or if that was sort of quite readily available that would allow you to
Yeah.
you
Well,
to do
I suppose that kind of links a bit to Sean's comments about, you know, have there been things done to this paper that have obliterated those marks even more? Because, as I said, there is such a huge difference between those two photographs.
Yeah. But I mean, even though, you know, we're sort of looking at this and sort of quite big scale types of drawing would actually be, so even then, just looking at the scale will highlight that more than you perhaps would.
Yeah.
It would be flashing.
Yeah, because when I first used to see this reproduced, I just thought this kind of mark on here was just, you know, the lines that you get on paper when it's laid on a mesh, but no, when you see it, but when you actually blow it, get the big reproduction of it, you see that it isn't at all.
Was it common to scribe paper at the time?
No?
Was it common to scribe paper?
There's some, I mean, well, what's interesting, that there's some Leonardo da Vinci drawings which are also pricked in a really similar way. Was it common? I don't know.
Well, you had pounds, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
reproduce, but to actually scribe the lines.
That's what's really interesting. Isn't
Yeah.
it?
Well, it is those scribed lines, and I suppose that's my interest in terms of light and the construction, and the fact that perspective is, in a sense, is to do with optics and light rays, and picture planes and things. There seems to be a very interesting connection between the two things. Maybe a sort of poetic connection rather than anything you could really tie down.
I think, I mean, for me that is one really particularly interesting area as many see sort of as practitioners, that idea that, I just also see it in the studio, people will come in and, maybe pick a piece of very translucent Japanese paper, or Lizzie working with wax papers, and some people working with oiled papers, and it's like, this is interesting because you're seeing what the light will do in terms of the content and the final piece, that it exists in that way because of the way that the light either absorbed, refracted from the paper. But this, in a way, is a different kind of proposition, that it's not like, and then the second possibility, if you're making a work, that you put it in a certain light in order to be able to see what you're doing. But this is something different again, isn't it? That idea that it can only develop, it can only emerge as a drawing if it's placed in certain lighting conditions, and its development, its whole existence relies on that. And I think that's something very unusual. I think as practitioners we think in a way much further along the line. How's this a translucent piece? I'm thinking about you Jill, the idea that you could have these translucent pieces of paper where the shadows of pigment coming through the paper, but to actually think of it as yet another tool to make a piece of work is a really conceptual. I think is a really interesting proposition that we all might be interested to kind of use in some way, because I don't think we think about it that much. I don't know what other people think.
I'm thinking I don't know if you were at the PhD talk where the girl was talking about glass from Sunderland, and her work developed because of the way the translucency and opacity worked, to do with the light, and the fact that she discovered about some original work that she found of somebody else's, how it appeared to be opaque, although it was the same. She thought it was to do with the thinness of the glass, and it wasn't. It was to do with the light. So her work kind of developed because of that, and it sort of relates in a way.
I mean, there's also some quite interesting research to do with these precious stones and so on that you see in paintings and so on, or stuck onto paintings. But there's a whole kind of bit of technology around fake stones, using oils and pigments and so on, which is a really interesting thing, that you're using, you think about paintings, and you're making a painting of something and sticking real things onto this, but the kind of material that you're using, the oil paint, is also the stuff that you're using to create the fake stuck on the real thing. So it's
in its own materiality.
It's I suspect these artists, it's just down to the basic level of artists making. We forget we go to the shops, we buy a pair of compasses and so on. these artists are probably making their own tools, or were, going to somebody and saying, I need this, to do this, and it needs to be this sharp, so I can do this with it. Whereas we've kind of lost a lot of that. I mean, he may well have said to a paper maker, I want to be able to do this with this paper. Can you? How do we do something to the paper so it's hard enough for me to be able to sort of score into it without it tearing? Because I have tried this on various papers, and it is actually quite hard to do without actually ripping the surface.
You would think that you might have tried it on parchment if it is as old as that, because parchment would withstand that rather than. But the fact that a lot of them don't exist, maybe other paper wasn't as thick as that one and they fell apart.
Do you know any details about the actual lighting on this image in terms of the angle at which it was in relation to the drawing that it focused?
To me, have I kind of speculated what kind of angle he would have had it?
Well, I mean, both in the taking of this photograph, but also in the making of the drawing. Because I mean, I sort of wonder how much that factors into us reading the sort of surface and the paper, and how much control, when the drawing was originally done, there might have been in focusing light and angling light from the candle.
I don't know. I kind of imagined that it would have been done. I mean, think about him making, or whoever it was who made the drawing. I imagined that he would be sitting at a slightly slanting table with a window there, the light coming in. I can't see how else it could work, or to the side or whatever. But probably going this way across the drawing.
You don't think there was necessarily a particular attempt of manipulation of light to aid the drawing, to read the score marks?
I think just ordinary daylight would be enough. If you were in a sort of darkish room and you had daylight coming in through a window, I haven't tested it, but I suppose that would be the thing to do, is actually try it out. What the optimum time of year is, or
I suppose it's that sense though, as I imagine that today we would probably want to reveal those scored marks, whereas you wonder if they were being used as kind of tools for pinpricks and whatever, whether they would be wanting to sort of
hide.
Yes,
Yeah.
Well, I think
once it was completed, because if we take there's a premise that they were used as guides and markers, tools, etc., then you'd think that they would want to that not to be seen in the final drawing.
Well, I think this is maybe what I was getting at, in a way that if you could sort of manipulate or sort of direct a light source that would highlight your marks that outside of that environment, perhaps unless you replicate that sort of light source, those score marks will sort of be rendered more visible. And hence why, say, in this photograph, whether coincidentally or on purpose, the light was deliberately directed to highlight those lights.
Yeah, I mean, presumably when they were playing around with this, they would have tried the light in lots of different positions and ended up with an optimum light. I mean, you can, it's obviously been done from the side, isn't it? It's been done from this side. I mean, it's interesting that that centre line, that's must have been probably scored into the paper as well, actually shows up quite a lot. So I presume the drawing hasn't been folded. That centre line, that score, is also quite a prominent mark. Which, the more I think about it, the more I do think maybe conservators have at some point put was through a press or something.
Well, they could have done the relaxation.
Or relaxation
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm always amazed at in Florence is that these things are just kept in these drawers. The whole environment doesn't seem particularly controlled. You know, so it's bloody hot and humid in the summer and bloody freezing cold and damp in the winter, which I think isn't going to do these things a huge amount of good. But I don't know, maybe paper isn't quite so. I suppose as long as it doesn't get mouldy.
Mould and the insects. Does anyone have any sort of final thoughts or questions before we finish for today?
But if anybody wants any lessons in drawing one of these, I'm happy to do it.
That is a challenge, isn't it? That sounds like
It's
a workshop.
a lot simpler than you'd think in terms of what you need to do is just keeping control of it. That's the hard bit, keeping track of where you are. And that's, I think that's, you know, a pretty impressive feat with this, is keeping track of where you are. You know, there's only, sorry, that's me. There's only a few places where you see little glitches where he's joined, when he's been inking it in, it's just slightly off. But on a drawing that scale, you know, to be out, say, a millimetre would look quite a lot. Yeah. So I'm just sorry. Yeah. But as I say, if anybody's interested, I'll happily show them how it works. You wouldn't start off with a 32-sided thing, you'd start off with sort of an 8-sided thing and then work up to the somewhat